Good afternoon, everyone. We're gonna try to keep on schedule and start our conversation with three amazing guests today. I'm Tom VECCHIONE. I teach at Cornell University. I'm very focused on building repositioning. I'm on the Schack Advisory Board as well as Center for Urban Future and New York Landmarks Preservation. Today's conversation, as you know, is about re-entering from a global pandemic and how the biggest cities are emerging. And we're finding that are incredibly successful. There's lots of challenges out there. The Kearney 2021 Global Cities Report puts New York number one, London next, Paris, and then Tokyo. But I think the conversation today is really focused on how do we keep New York number one, how to ensure its competitiveness, and what are the priorities and outlooks we're looking for the next year and beyond to really become and continue to be the global center of commerce on the planet. So let me just quickly introduce Sam. As you all know, Dean, CECILIA, Vice President of Economic Development, really focused on over $1 billion worth of active projects in amenities and infrastructure. And Mitchell Moss, who the New York Times calls the New Yorkologist, if I got that right, which I love that expression. So we're just going to jump right in because we have 45 minutes and we want to be able to save some time for Q&A. So CECILIA, I'm going to start with our conversation from Friday. From the Economic Development Corporation's perspective, what are the key priorities of investment we need to start to think about coming from out of this freeze to thaw?
Yeah, absolutely, and so good to be with all of you and here. So just to give you a little bit of background, New York City EDC, we're the economic development arm of the City of New York. We're a mission-driven nonprofit organization, and our goal is to do two things: really strengthen neighborhoods and create good jobs. So there are three things that we're really looking at coming out of the pandemic. The first one is continuing, which is kind of core to our mission, to invest in the future industry. So making sure that the economy of New York City continues to diversify and that we're looking at industries that have enormous potential growth in the next generation. So that's life science for us, and the mayor is like really doubled down on investment in life science. That's also offshore wind. So it's a grounding up a brand new industry in New York City and making sure that we kind of become the construction and operation and maintenance hub for a lot of offshore wind farms across the Atlantic Ocean. So we're really excited about this one. The second one is climate change. We need to contend with the fact that we are a city of waterfronts. We have 520 miles of waterfronts, so we need to make sure that we adapt to the threats of climate change. We're currently working on a master plan for the financial district in the Seaport area, which is so central to New York City's economy. So we want to make sure that these areas are actually protected as we see a lot of sea level rise and storm surge threats coming into the future. And then the pandemic happened, and there was a lot of lessons learned during the pandemic for the city on how to prepare and how to adapt. And one of the things that we learned is how can we, in the future, be able to scale up technology and scale up real-time data and management better. And how do we make sure that kind of the racial inequities that we've seen and how the pandemic has hurt New York don't get reproduced anymore. So we just seeded capital money to something that is called the Pandemic Response Institute, which is going to be a collaboration between us, CUNY, Columbia, that is going to be solely dedicated to really prepare New York City for future pandemics, because unfortunately, it's probably not the last one of our lifetime. And make sure that we have the right infrastructure. So it's just making sure that we're both looking at risk, but also looking at opportunities for the future. Those things to combine together.
Sam, what CECILIA brought up, and I know you have a focus on urban epidemiology, do you want to elaborate a little bit on sort of our response for the pandemic and then sort of how we are coming out of it and we are more responsive in the future?
Sure. I think that with respect to the pandemic, and folks have mentioned this earlier in the day, it differs from previous crises and previous cycles in that it was an exogenous shock impacting real estate, whereas in the financial crisis, the question was, where and how will we see more robust financing become available to support the real estate industry? In the case of the pandemic, it's been much more of an existential crisis, where the pandemic has led many people to question the fundamental value of physical and geographic co-location, which presents a threat to New York City and to other very dense urban areas. It strikes at the heart of agglomeration economies. But I think what is clear is that our sense of responsiveness, the sense that we need to be prepared and ready and be learning lessons from what has gone well and what has not gone as well in terms of our pandemic response is going to inform our thinking about a broad definition of infrastructure as we go forward. And so where I liken public health issues, and it's not just pandemic. I think the biggest mistake we can make in terms of our interpretation of pandemic, how we think about the public health response, is to define what our needs and investments are for public health solely in terms of some infectious disease event. And this has been the most significant and devastating disease event in US history. It's killed more Americans than the Spanish flu. That being said, there are a whole range of challenges that we face in terms of how we address public health issues that are impediments to continued growth and competitiveness in the city. Access to high quality health care, access, and it may be just sort of, does the subway system let you get to a doctor easily? What's the quality and capacity of the emergency room? Do we have access to good quality housing? All of that features into the public health debate. When we think about infectious diseases on one hand, but ultimately, following what we refer to as the epidemiological transition, many more people experiencing setbacks related to chronic diseases than infectious diseases, the way we think about providing public parks and open spaces for people to be outside is also part of our public health response. To see the Pandemic Institute being created, to see some of that infrastructure money becoming available over the next couple of years, if we have a convergence of continued focus on needing to improve public health outcomes and careful thinking about how it is that we can apply infrastructure dollars to actually improve those outcomes, then I think inevitably we'll be in a better place. Last point on this, so often coming out of a crisis, we prepare for the crisis we just had, rather than the range of possibilities for what could happen next. If that public health response, again, is focused solely on that next infectious disease or the next mutation of the coronavirus, as it becomes endemic rather than pandemic, then we will have missed the point that there are a range of public health challenges that we face in the city, and if we want to remain competitive in terms of maintaining our occupational diversity, we need teachers, firemen, policemen, other people who serve the community to be able to live in the community, to be able to invest in the community. All of that becomes critical to our continued competitiveness as a city as we look forward.
I want to take one piece of that, Mitchell, and throw it out to you because we talked about this last week. Being an expert in transportation and advisor to our mayors and governor, hit hardest with the subways and transportation. What are your thoughts about, and that is sort of the platform for New York, is mass transportation, mass transit movement. Give us some insights on where you think our transportation system is going and where it needs to go.
Well, first, thank you, Tom. I have to first say that disasters have been part of New York's history and part of its success. We had the yellow fever in 1793. We actually had a quarantine. We wouldn't let any ships come from Philadelphia. The cholera epidemic of the 1850s is the reason we have a great water supply. We had a snowstorm in the late 1880s, which made us go underground with our subway system. So, and of course, the Spanish flu. But we've had real health disasters, and some of those have triggered the greatest public and civic responses, which is why we then built Central Park in the 1850s, the subways, et cetera. And then, of course, we've had, serious governmental disasters. No one's talking about the near collapse of New York City. Bill Ruden's dad did, but in the 1970s, we had, of course, the financial crisis of 2008, which actually gave New York's banks the greatest gift of all, which was to let the middle-sized banks around the country fail. New York now has greater share of bank deposits than it's ever had because all those third-rate, mediocre banks in Oklahoma and Texas collapsed. We should be very happy today that there are fewer banks and they're more based in New York. And Bank America, which claims to be in Charlotte, is really a non-territorial bank. So I think we have to appreciate that disasters, one, don't necessarily mean the end of New York, but they give the chance for the city to reinvent itself. Now let's go to this question about this mass transit. Let me say three things. While New York City schools failed, they closed the schools, the subways were running except for 4 hours a day. We should be very recognized. That told you that we put 5 million or 3 million or 2 million subway riders ahead of the 1 million school children. So we have a lost generation of kids because they certainly didn't get educated. Most of them certainly didn't have the benefit of private schools or the Catholic schools, which never closed. So mass transit worked. I have to say 3 things. We were very lucky. We had great leadership at the time, Pat Foy and now Janet Lieber, because they were able to get Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer to pour cash into mass transit. And as you heard yesterday, Governor Hochul said they're not going to raise the fare and they're not going to have cutbacks. So one thing we now know is that the bill signed yesterday, and I think today's conference, Sam, I want you to know the conference today is due totally to the fact that Sam scheduled it 2 days after the president, 1 day after the president signed the bill. I think he signed the bill to make the conference successful. So what I would say is that this bill is going to help save the city because of 3 reasons. One, we're going to do the projects we should have done, which is to modernize it. Before we get to this ridiculous effort by every elected official to say, I have my pet project, the first thing we should do is take the gem and bring it into the 21st century. Do not do what Washington, D.C. did. Expand, 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 so they have nothing except a decaying system at the core. We have to take what we have, bring it into current standards. That's why this money is important. And then there'll be expansion on the 2nd Avenue subway, the Gateway, obviously, which is Senator Schumer's favorite project. And of course, we have to appreciate the investment is modernizing and maintaining. And the third part I want to say, and I really want to say the panel already talked about the importance of making the mass transit system something people are comfortable in. I don't think it's just crime. Like Bill Rudin, actually, crime isn't the problem with the subways. It's the physical kind of sense of discomfort you get because there's been a real decline in the kind of conditions there. So if we turn around and realize that the office market depends on mass transit, because you can't get everybody into those buildings if they drive. The average subway car has 180 to 200 person in it. A train has 2,000. Why do you think people work in Midtown? Because that's where the major lines converge, or downtown. And so there's nothing more efficient than moving 50,000 people an hour underground. If that doesn't work, the office market doesn't work. And so I think if we can find a way to do this in a time when I think we'll find fewer people commuting from the suburbs have made New York's metropolitan region far bigger, because now we have bankers doing deals on the beaches of Bridgehampton. It's anyone who thinks that, that you can't do something electronic, you should ask anybody who's now finding out that they don't have to have notary publics or anybody else. There's nothing you can't do digitally. And I just want to say, this economy showed how bipolar it is. Anything face-to-face, restaurants, theater, arts, music, it was dead for 20 months. Everything else, the New York Times has now got a record number of online subscribers, 8 million, and no one's in the building. You should look at the TV networks. They had an automatic camera. They had one person, and they would bring in, Don Lemon from CNN would come in from the Sag Harbor. We had the greatest success of intellectual performance. More technological advances were made in 20 months than the previous 20 years. And this is the resilience of New York, that even though they weren't together, they were productive. Bank profits are up today. The law firms are showing they made record profits. There's $9 billion more at the state government today because they raised the taxes, they had the Pelosi-Schumer gift, and they had a booming economy. So we should be very clear that at the same time, we have an unemployment rate that's double the nation's in New York City. So we have 2 different economies, and the pandemic revealed how deeply different they are.
On delivering on the idea of different economies, and Cecilia, what you said about the emerging workforce and the initiatives behind the Economic Development Corps to diversify our workforce, to go into the digital economy, go into life science. What's the perspective that Mitchell was bringing up about resiliency from the perspective of the Economic Development Corps and job diversity and growth?
Yeah, I think we're looking at 2 different ways. One is making sure that the economy is diversified. So we should be the place where all new industries come and where they thrive. The second one is we should make sure that all New Yorkers have the ability to participate in this new economy. And so each time we make an investment in industry, so life science and offshore winds are 2 perfect examples, we make sure that a portion of the money that we seed or that we spend is directly related to workforce development. So for life science, we're funding an internship so that if you're a New Yorker and you're going to high school or you're going to CUNY, you have the opportunity to get and tap into an industry that you may not know existed right before, because that's not the network in which you are. Same thing with offshore wind. Like the investment is being done on our asset at EDC, and 40% of the capital investment we're making is going to have to go to MWB firms. So to make sure that, like, as we move into a green economy, because that's what this is just about decarbonization and like the new types of jobs, New Yorkers and New York firms actually, and the diversity of New York firms and New Yorkers actually have the opportunity to tap into it. So each time we look at growing the economy, we need to look at diversifying the economy and making sure that New Yorkers actually benefit from it. We do that also, we do a lot of like real estate development on city-owned land through requests for development and other proposals. And we do that with developers as well. So we're more and more ensuring that if we have a sizable piece of land, we're asking a very large developer to partner with a smaller developer that may be an MWB firm, an emerging developer that does not have the capacity today to be able to bid on a really big city job, but could be mentored and grown into doing it in the future. So it's making sure that we're creating ladders for New Yorkers to actually benefit from the economy. So we're trying to kind of repair this kind of like two systems that we've had for a very long time, and being incredibly intentional about it and measuring success in that way as well. So it's not the number of jobs, but it's making sure they're good jobs and making sure they're good jobs where New Yorkers can participate in.
Mitchell, when you were saying about the commuting back and then Cecilia's point of view about continuing to diversify and the difference between diversification and growth, do you think that, we're not going to rebound in terms of the commuting population that we had? What you were saying in terms of the seamlessness and ease of working remotely, do you think there's a performance metric that's going to impact us?
I think the speakers earlier today don't understand remote work. It has nothing to do with where you work. It's people want to control their time. And technology during the pandemic has shown people at all levels that they don't mind working in home and other settings if it gives them a chance to figure out how to do it. Today, Portugal has announced that they're going to ban employers from calling their employees who work remotely after hours. Portugal has said, in fact, we're going to have the companies pay for the upgrade in the phone systems so they can work remotely. But the reason I say this is that we have people working remotely who live in Soho. In all candor, they don't want to be in the office because they feel they're as productive at home. At 10 o'clock, they go out and get their coffee. They may walk their dog. God knows they go to the gym. We have changed the way time is managed as a result of the advantages brought about by remote work. And that's not going to change. So I think when I'm very happy to hear that, that the average work was 4.2 days a week before the pandemic, it's going to be 3.2. In about a year. If we ever, by the way, anyone who thinks they know when people are coming back to the office is living in some delusionary world, because today the pandemic is booming in Europe. So we have no idea whether it's January or June, but we do know one thing. The office economy has turned out to be very resilient, even when it's not in the office. And of course, long-term leases mean that the rent is being paid, so the suffering has been much more people who have lost their jobs. But back to your question. I worry less about diversification than the loss of skills. Enrollment in the city university is down 15%. Enrollment in the public schools is down 5% last year, 4% this year. 10 to 11% of Americans are now homeschooling. So we may find out that actually, we have a lost generation of school children in some cases because a lot of the kids who were home weren't being schooled at home. So I'm much more concerned about the fact that, we should be making sure that the young people get the skills wherever they get them, in community colleges and four-year colleges and in public schools, because right now, we've become much too cavalier about recognizing that that's been a serious flaw. And anyone who's familiar with what's happened is that the political year has shown that schools are back on the national agenda, and part of it is parents are so angry at how they were treated that they're taking it out whoever's, how McAuliffe could campaign with Randy Weingarten is beyond me. Because she's the symbol of what the parents are upset about, which is that we surrendered the schools to the teachers union. During the Spanish flu, every New York City public school was open, and the mayor had a nurse at every door taking the temperature. So we abandoned the school children in New York last year. Every other public servant, cops, firemen, nurses, they had to come to work. Why not school teachers?
When there's been two sides to this conversation. I think all three of you have mentioned it. And Sam, I'm going to toss it back to you. This concept of talent in the innovation economy and the concept of labor, logistics, supply, and getting stuff done. Sam, I know beyond the epidemiology and urbanism, you're focused on agglomeration, but at both sides in terms of, who are the day-to-day workers that we need to support and the talent that we need to import and continue to grow. Do you think it's an either or? Do you think, how should we be thinking about both of those labor pools?
Sure. I think Mitchell's point is a critically important one in that we have more jobs open and available today in the United States than we've ever had. When we think about the level of disengagement in the workforce, and sometimes it's framed as the Great Resignation, I think that is a misnomer because it implies that well-qualified people are stepping back from the labor force, where in fact, the data suggests that in a very tight, highly competitive labor market for skilled labor, people are not resigning or stepping back. They're finding different roles and finding ways to ensure that they are compensated. The way that they're thinking about compensation is different from what we might have seen historically. And so, you look at sort of a population of a relatively young demographic that might have prioritized, firm visibility and prestige and dollar compensation as the two things that would maximize their utility function coming out of school. I think what we see now is that part of what factors into the equation and firms are having to think carefully about is how they do provide for that flexibility in the management of time. And so, folks are asking, what does my work life, not necessarily the work life, but what kind of autonomy do I have over decisions about where I can be an economically productive agent and participant in the economy? So that becomes really important. The other piece of this that Mitchell's raising that I think is very important for us, we're obviously two folks who are immersed in the academic world, the critical importance of academic institutions, not just sort of the traditional four-year university, but community colleges and other more novel emerging forms of content and education delivery. We're in for sort of a reckoning in terms of how we think about the educational infrastructure of this country. It is not necessarily the case that it is appropriate or maximizing in terms of returns for everyone to go to to pursue a four-year degree. There are lots of different ways in which people can learn, can develop peer groups. And when we think about sort of helping to identify the mismatches between who's available in the labor pool and all of those jobs that need to be filled, there's a lot of hard work that I think needs to be done across the range of these academic institutions in thinking about how do we offer a more flexible model? How do we allow people to learn and acquire new skills in an economy where it is the nature of technology that from one cycle to the next, the skills that make you relevant have never changed more quickly. So that becomes an important piece of this.
Sam, I want to say something. We heard something at lunch, which is the power of the residential market versus the office market. And I think this is really important because the essence of cities, wherever they are, is human contact. And what we find out is that, and we all know someone who's moved to Wyoming or Maine, and or Vermont, and of course others go to Florida. What New York has is the density of opportunities for interaction. And so what draws young people here especially is that, the last thing they want to do is live with their parents. I mean, they'd rather be in prison. In fact, there's no difference. So I would say that the key part here is New York is turning out to be benefiting. This will drive real estate landlords because young people can afford to pay rent again. And because the rents have gone down in parts of the city, and so they were able to sign leases. And we're actually repopulating the city. So if I'll take 2 young people for every aging banker who moves to Palm Beach. In fact, I'll take 1 for 1 because that's the future. I'm really not worried about, if people want to move to Florida, we should send them, pack the bags, give them a ticket, but make it one way. Whatever we lose in taxes, we'll make up in human capital. And so I think it's very important to understand that's where higher education is one of the city's great magnets. We have more foreign students in New York City than any city in the country. And by the way, their parents rent them an apartment. They're not going to live in a dorm. They pay full tuition because America isn't going to give them scholarships at the level they give domestic students. And so our great asset is that we still attract people from around the world. And this time they're coming here to go to school as well as to set up business. So, in a sense, we have to strengthen that sector because that's the one sector where face-to-face interaction is still hard to duplicate. We saw today a great example of how ineffective Zoom is for a guy who believes in coming to work. So if he can't get Zoom right, then I'm up to, God knows, I want to know what they're doing at Hudson Yards. But the point is, we have a city where we have to encourage any opportunity face-to-face, and that's why office buildings are now incorporating all these different aspects. But today the modern apartment building looks like a yacht. We have a dog run, we have a theater, we have a swimming pool. Modern residential complexes, they try and do everything you can possibly do to internalize it. But of course they can't because of the density, and so that's why parks are more important. So I just want to make a picture, a simple idea. It's not crime. We have to make New York as livable as possible for as many people as possible, and as long as they have choices, that's why CUNY and two-year college is so important. As long as they have choices, the city will find a way for them to find their path, whatever that is. Anyone who thinks we can predict, 2007, the iPhone came. What would we do if we didn't have Steve Jobs and the iPhone? That led to Uber, all kinds of things, banking by phone, shopping by phone. Well, I know people who don't ever stop shopping. All they have is permanent feeds of shopping, of stuff coming in. By the way, they're getting online therapy every minute because they're buying and they have no idea what it looks like and they can return it. We have to face the fact that the next 50 years are going to see even more advances in this. And New York's great advantage is that it will be the only place where you still have face-to-face and digital connectivity. Because as everyone becomes isolated, the handful of cities which offer face-to-face become more valuable. Remember, so that's why the handful of global cities are going to be the places that flourish, because that's where the opportunities are for face-to-face that are most abundant and easier to do.
Well, that's such an interesting point in terms of,
I wouldn't bet on Ithaca.
Go there every week. I love Ithaca. I think what you bring up in terms of housing, face-to-face, density, diversity. Cecilia, I wanted to ask you a question about what the economic development's point of view about the soft economy of New York. Basically New York is just a great place to be. So many young people, I know from teaching at Cornell, they want to come to New York, they want to come to cities, they want to be here, they want the lifestyle, the whole lifestyle, right? And job growth obviously is the epicenter of that. What are some thoughts from your perspective? I know you've worked in Paris, you've worked in London. How do we project ourselves differently than other global cities, and what is our advantage and disadvantage?
Yeah. Well, first of all, just on what Mitchell says, which is, I think, really important, people didn't pay attention enough to the results of the census. 600,000 additional New Yorkers moved there in the last 10 years. That's an enormous number. So the city is growing. The city has been growing for 20 years. We have, managing growth is the planning issue that we have fundamentally. So I think just people vote with their feet. This is when we know whether or not we're successful, is whether or not we're growing as a city, and we are tremendously growing. I think a lot of what the pandemic has allowed is a series of urban experimentations, things that we never thought would be possible, like eating at a restaurant outdoor, being able to have full streets being closed, have a series of options on micromobility, all of those things that had been part of conversations in the planning field for a very long time, that a lot of, I think, competitive European cities had been moving on much earlier than we have, finally just became possible in just a heartbeat. And so I think a lot of what we've been doing at EDC and what we're really excited about is how do we then make sure that these very, I think on the broad scale, successful experimentations actually become kind of the future of how the city is built and how the city developed. So one of the things we did, for example, during the pandemic is we worked with DAIA to create something that's called Design Core, which was a public-private partnership. So between us, there were a lot of architects that didn't have work because they were in the pandemic. So they were willing to do pro bono work to assist restaurants to design a good outdoor space. So one that was attractive within the brand of the restaurant, and they could get this consulting service for free. So we did a lot of bringing people together in order to create fast solutions to issues, and we're continuing to be engaged in that topic. Another thing we're really engaged in is biking has exploded. Micromobility has exploded. We run the NYC ferry, and it's the transit that has recovered the most. We're 80% of our pre-pandemic ridership numbers. So we think it's really important that New Yorkers have mobility options. It's really important that subway recovers, and we continue to invest in it, but it's also important that people have multiple options in the way they want to explore the city, which is not just commuting to work, which is like a lot of different routes and a lot of different activities that they want to do. So we're looking at like bike ownership and employer-based bike ownership, actually with NYU Rudin. We're looking at like micromobility. We're looking at like how one should design the street of the future that is actually more efficient and looks at all of these uses in relationship with each other. And we're also looking, something that's become incredibly important during the pandemic is just open space. It's like people have come back to open space with, I think, so much kind of love and desire for being outdoor and experiencing the city in a different way. So one of the projects we're doing, and the city, Mayor de Blasio has given us $700 million, is closing the Manhattan Greenway. That's 32 miles of a loop that would allow you to just bike and walk around the entire island of Manhattan. We currently have about like 4 miles of gaps. A lot of them are uptown, Harlem, East Harlem, Inwood. And so just closing them is really important. When you look at like these 32 miles altogether, that's bigger than Central Park. That's 10,000 bikers a day. It's an enormous infrastructure for the future of the city. So I think it's really looking at like, how do we build upon what the pandemic has shown of how New York wants to live in the city and build upon that.
Sam, I know that I'll ask you one last question, and then we have about 10 minutes for some audience questions as well. Sam, I know you're a huge supporter of the spaces in between and placemaking and sort of how do we think about our cities. Is there anything you want to add to what Cecilia said? Because I know that's so powerful in how you look at cities.
Sure. I think probably the most critical thing that comes to mind when we think about closing this greenway in Manhattan in particular is from an equity perspective to also be thinking about how we have the opportunity to explore creating safe, livable outdoor spaces for people across the entire city. From a public health perspective, we know that easy pedestrian access to a good quality outdoor space impacts the outcomes that we see. We also know that if we concentrate these amenities on the island of Manhattan, very much like other amenities we've introduced on the west side, they have the potential to be amenitized into the value of real estate assets in a way that leads to further separation of communities. And so, for the person who let's say we have an expansion of the Greenway, and it's highly popular. The person who owns their home sees the benefit of that in terms of the capitalization into increased equity value in their home. For the person who is income constrained and may rent their apartment, they experience that same investment in the form of higher rent a year from now. That has the potential then to result in displacement of that person, of that household, of that community. So it's a classic gentrification issue that I think we need to be addressing when thinking about how it is that from a spatial perspective, we make all of these amenities available to a broad, an inclusive mix of New Yorkers. The other thing that you mentioned, I know this is an area where we have tremendous experience, is when we're thinking about outdoor space, we've just come off of a major global climate agreement that I think no one is ultimately going to be happy with, because some folks you're going to be congratulating themselves for having reached an agreement, and a lot of folks are going to be thinking about how we've made so many compromises to get to agreement that have we really changed the trajectory of what we see happening with the planet? But as part of our thinking about how we expand access to public spaces, build infrastructure and amenities, the climate work that that you're doing, that others are doing, and thinking about how perhaps the most significant long-term risk to New York's ability to be the place that, as Mitchell described, provides the greatest density of opportunity for interaction, meaningful interactions. Perhaps one of the greatest long-term threats to that is the climate challenges that we face in New York City and elsewhere.
Can I just say something about interaction? We've talked about it in terms of work. So there's recent research which shows, and I think Twitter has done the analysis, that one of the great ironies is that Manhattan has gotten a lot of discussion today, but what's happened during the past 20 months is that people have discovered the neighborhoods of New York. Now people live there already knew them, But now people prefer to live near a park than near a subway station because they're not going in 3 days. They're only going in 3 days, if at all. We also find out they want to be near a dog run. But even, and I should point this out since it hasn't been raised, you know, and I can only say, fortunately, I have a lot of smarter people who work for me than me. So they've told me that the analysis shows that people are using Tinder to pick people who are within a geographic boundary where they live. Because it's more efficient to be able to go and meet someone a half a mile away than to drive, let's say, 30 miles if you're in upstate New York, not to be repeating myself. So the point here is that in this world, the geography of proximity is actually more important for people who are using Tinder than ever before because, you know, in fact, if you don't like the person after a half hour, you go back and you find someone else. So the entire social structure of the online dating is now focused on localism because you're more productive in interaction if you can find your boundaries to where you can get to easily. So there's some things about New York's advantages that we haven't really fully understood, which is why young people are here. You know, there's more chance to meet people here than in a rural area.
Well, I think we could field maybe
Probably one or two.
One question. Is there a burning question from the audience, from our three experts on health, investment, and transportation that we want to share with the larger group?
I've been waiting for that.
If not, I just have to say I'm incredibly optimistic about. I didn't really recognize how many things that when we came out of the pandemic we learned to use and reuse and rethink in New York. Surfacing and resurfacing the issues of density in a face-to-face city. It's just so powerful to always recognize that we are the ultimate face-to-face city. And I think, Sam, the way we look at just our academic system and the ability to grow talent and bring young people here and be sort of the premier learning center of the world too. So I know I'll leave each one of you to say what we should believe in or think about for the next year and where you think our biggest opportunities could be. Mitchell, why don't you?
Local Tinder.
I have to stick to what I know. I think the focus of New York, has to be recognizing that we've come through a tough time, but we were saved by vast amount of federal money, and that's going to end in a year. And in a kind of crazy way, the challenge will be the governor and the mayor have to understand that they're going to have to manage much more carefully and prudently, that there isn't an infinite bank book in Washington. And I think that we have to be careful not to become kind of promising people that we're going to do things that the money isn't going to be there for. So this vast amount of money has to be well spent. In fact, we have a burden to use the money more carefully because it's a one-time opportunity. And that's why I think, the elected officials have to recognize that however good it is, it's not going to be there forever.
Cecilia?
I think I would say the New Yorkers have reconnected with the physicality of the city in a different way through the pandemic. I think they've learned to love the city and love its public space and understanding the value of connection, just the value of being here today compared to the experience of last year. And I think what we're really trying to do is to harness these learnings and not just turn the page too quickly and move on and not realize that there's a tremendous amount of lessons learned of how the city has worked, not worked, where it has worked, for whom it has worked, and that we really use all of these learnings to inform future investment and policy.
As we're preparing for, with the Pandemic Institute, thinking about how it is that we build resilience to that next public health shock, thinking broadly about what that public health shock could be, because it won't necessarily be a repeat of what we've just experienced, what we are experiencing today. And to Mitchell's point, very difficult to foresee exactly the trajectory that it will take. Mutation is by definition a random occurrence that can't be effectively predicted. My closing point will be sort of to return back to Mitchell's point, thinking carefully about local fiscal policy. As anyone who owns or invests in or lends against real estate, all of that real estate exists in the context of a city. And if that city is not competitive, it undermines the value and viability of our real estate. If you don't think that we can get the balance of taxes and costs versus agglomeration benefits wrong, look at the example of what has happened to New York City over the course of a few decades ago, what happened to Philadelphia when taxes relative to benefits of locating in the middle of that agglomeration sort of came out of balance. We can undermine ourselves if we're not thinking carefully about how it is that we ensure that from a fiscal perspective, New York is still a great place to live even after a lot of those federal transfers run out.
Well, thanks for an amazing conversation, Mitchell, Cecilia, and Sam. What a great combination, everyone representing a different aspect and different point of view of this incredible city. So thank you so much.